You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Elyssa Friedland.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show lined up for you. Before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Crystal Pico Watanabe at Pico's House. The Pico's House website now has a new look. She's got a team of 8 people who help provide services to fiction authors. She has a full slate of services that now include beta reading. She's got 4 beta readers now. So if you're looking for beta reading services, she can definitely take on your project. Manuscript critique, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Authors can also inquire about putting their books in her Book Lovers Box, which is a monthly digital subscription box with a different theme each month. It's free to authors for a limited time. Be sure to check out Crystal and her whole team at Pico's House. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com. Thanks, Crystal, for sponsoring the show. While cape and spandex movies are breaking box office records, comic book commentator and influencer Ed Gosney doesn't want us to forget the roots of these marvelous wonders. His blog, Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com, covers the gamut of 4-color entertainment, from contemporary comic books to comics made for kids to bargain bin gold to classics that will transport you back in time. Comic books are a perfect blend of art and story, and Cool Comics captures the essence of what these funny books mean to us in a personal way. And make sure to join the Cool Comics in My Collection Facebook group, where members can interact, show off their prized comics, and have opportunities to win. You guessed it, Cool Comics. Published weekly, Cool Comics in My Collection aims to bring you a smile and reminds us why comic books are fun. Be sure to visit edgosney.com today. Speaking of superheroes and comics, my friend Patricia Gilliam has a fantastic series called The Heroes of Corvus. It begins with Book 1, a flight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the deaths of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city aren't out of danger. This is such a phenomenal story. She has released up to part 4 now, and I cannot wait for part 5 to come out. If you're looking for a great adventure read that's on the cutting edge of what is in today's entertainment, The Heroes of Corvus is the series for you by Patricia Gilliam. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go to hankgarner.com to subscribe to the show. We're on just about every platform you can imagine. Now stay tuned for our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Elyssa Friedland on the show with me, back for another visit. She was on with us last year talking about her new book at the time, The Intermission, and she's got a brand new release called The Floating Feldmans. That's a bit of a departure from last year, but if you love The Intermission, you're going to love this book. It hits on a lot of the same notes that made that book so great. Welcome back to the show, Elyssa.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
I'm excited to have you. So last summer we talked about The Intermission, and that book was such an awesome look at marriage and relationships in general, and got deeper than I was expecting, I know, and wound up being a really poignant book. And how has life been since the Intermission?
It's been great. So the book was definitely evocative for many people. I think it caused a lot of people to reflect on their own relationships, and consequently, people who read it opened up to me about their marriages, which I was not expecting because, fiction is somewhat of a departure from reality. And I don't typically that was my second book. And I didn't really get so much personal stories out of people from my first book. And so this was like heavy stuff, and people were direct messaging me on Instagram and Facebook telling me that it made them feel differently about their marriage or their divorce or whether they wanted to marry their partner. And it was like, oh no, that feels like a lot of responsibility in a way. So it was exciting that people connected to it so deeply, but also it was like a little stressful that it had such an effect on people.
Yeah. That when you started writing that book, what was the first intention? Because you said that you were kind of taken by surprise that it resonated so deeply with people.
Right.
Did you see it going that way at all?
Well, I guess because when I first started out, I thought it was going to be a more humorous book, like the new book, The Floating Feldmans, which is definitely I'm going with a humor angle, which is really like the voice that I'm the most comfortable with. But it just sort of like happened. I don't really outline. I just write. I've never been able to successfully outline because I just feel like it totally stymies my creativity. So I sat down to write this book about a couple that was like, everything's pretty good. It's not amazing. They're about to have a child and they're gonna, everything's going fine. And then like the wife has a bit of a freak out and they're like, all right, let's just do an experiment and we'll sort of be apart for 6 months. And it was meant to kind of be like 6 months of hilarious dates that, go terribly wrong or are painfully awkward. And they kind of realize that like they're better off sticking where they are. That was the original intention. But then I guess marriage is such a serious topic that it's hard to really be that like flippant about it. And as I started writing, it just got a lot deeper. And I was like, it ended up just being a much meatier, grittier story as it unfolded. So it just had a life of its own, I guess you could say.
That's it's so weird how stories you kind of get away from us and become their own thing. We joke a lot about writers being the only people that can talk about talking to the voices in their head and no one looks at them strange. We all just kind of nod our heads like, yes, my characters talk to me as well.
Right.
When you're in the writing process and you feel the tone shifting, do those characters come alive? And since you're not an outliner, do the characters tend to steer the story?
They really do. And I close my eyes and I just imagine them having their dialogue, which is like, I, for some reason, always imagine dialogue with my eyes closed. I don't know. I guess because it just like makes me think I'm in the room with the characters. And yeah, they really do take on a life of their own. Same thing with the new book, like, which has many more characters. It was a lot of voices in my head. And I never know what they're going to say. And there is revision. I don't just always go with my first instinct. I mean, a lot of what they're going to say ends up looking terrible on the page, and I have to go back and change it, either to like make it sound better or just even make it more authentic and more realistic dialogue. But yeah, no, I do a lot of free form, eyes closed. What's this conversation going to look like? What are these characters going to say? Yeah, I don't ever like really say. I don't write character outlines. I don't write plot outlines. Like I really like to just see where it goes, which has seemed to work for me. I know it wouldn't work for a lot of people, but it works for me.
The Floating Feldmans, the new book, is your third novel. Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do you feel like your writing style or approach has changed in the course of the 3 books? Have you learned things that make it easier? Have you found little tools that you incorporate?
So I think the best thing that's happened over the course of my career since my first book is just meeting other writers, and I have more writer friends. So I just share my work with more people now whose opinion I trust. So there's that, which is great for feedback. And then also I like to just take a little extra challenge on every time. So the first book was a close third person, single narrator, very similar in profile to myself. So it wasn't like, it's still hard to write a book. Of course, you interview authors all day long, but the character wasn't that much of a stretch for me, and I wanted to challenge myself. So the second book, I said, all right, I'm going to do it from two perspectives, and I'm going to have one of them be a man, because I really wanted to take on the challenge of writing a man's voice. And that was fun and exciting, and also really cool. It doesn't have to be male, female, but it was really cool to have two people narrate the same scene, and you see how they interpret things so differently. So it's really like, you see how important perspective is. And like one person, you know, in the marriage or in a friendship thinks they're being really kind and conciliatory, but the other person, you know, totally misinterprets something they said. And only if you tell the story from two different perspectives and retell the same scenes through different eyes can the reader see that. And then when it came to the Floating Feldmans, which is this family saga on a cruise ship, I was like, I'm so into telling, you know, having different perspectives. I want to go even bigger now. And so I have 7 main characters. And I was really inspired by Cynthia Sweeney's book, The Nest, and This Is Where I Leave You by Jonathan Tropper, like books that are these family sagas where you really see all the members of the family's perspective. Because I thought, like, to really just be fair to everyone in the family, it wouldn't be right to just tell it through, let's say, the grandmother's eyes or, you know, the son's eyes. So I have everybody have their say, and I flexed my writing muscle with not only writing different genders, but also different ages. So I was writing 70-year-olds, and I was writing 16-year-olds in the book, which was a lot of fun for me because I did research, you know, and I talked to people in those age groups, and I don't know if I did them justice. I tried my best, you know, but it was a good writing challenge to try to write people who were totally different than myself in many ways.
One thing that, one thing that I love about your writing is, and I'm choosing my words carefully because I don't want to give the wrong impression. You approach family life and relationships, not tongue in cheek. That's not the right word, but with kind of a half smile. You know, all of our relationships, all of our families are weird. Everybody has, you know, strained and strange relationships, especially when family is concerned. But you always find a humorous way to lighten it up, without being just slapstick funny. It kind of with a wink and a nod, in a way. Even the Intermission, as heavy as that book was, there were still moments of levity and things that we could point out. We could see ourselves in it, and you have to kind of laugh at yourself. I mean, if you don't laugh at yourself, then you know, you're kind of missing out on some of the best parts of life. How do you tackle these heavy subjects in a lot of ways? With some levity that allows us to, you know, because if you can look at a tough thing with a smile, it sure goes down a lot easier than crying.
Yeah.
You know, could you just talk about your motivation there?
Well, that does come from within. I'm a really humorous person, and I find humor in a lot of situations. And sometimes I feel like my whole life is just sort of comedy of the absurd. And I look around and I'm like, is this really happening? Like, it could be anything from, like, I'm working on a group project and one of the writers just is so late and not turning anything in, and like basically every day makes like a my dog ate my homework excuse. And I, you know, I'm like, is this, I'll just think in my head, is this really happening? Like, instead of being annoyed, I laugh. I'm like, I cannot believe like that I'm seeing this. You know, the same thing goes with my family. I'm like, really, like, thinking about my mom and her complaining about something I did 15 years ago. And it's like, are you kidding? You know, and I could be annoyed, or I could be like, wow, this is actually happening right now. And not only is it happening, like, it's happening for the 100th time. Like, I've heard the story about the time I didn't call on Mother's Day, you know, and it's actually just hilarious that you're still bringing it up. I think it's like my coping mechanism. And I do think that people are sort of their worst selves around their family, because, like, if you're rotten around your friends, they're going to drop you, but your family is really stuck with you. And so when you kind of are your worst self, it can lead to a lot of funny situations and the things that people are willing to put up with from their family members. And then, of course, you bring in, like, the in-laws and the cousins and all the extended people, and there's just a lot of opportunity for humor. And I love to write humor, and I love to experience humor. I happen just in my real life to be a huge laugher. Like, a lot of things make me laugh, and so I guess I'm blessed with a funny bone. So it comes. I think that, like, in my family, I'm one of the only funny people, and like I think it helps me deal with interpersonal relations in a way that, like, some of my other family members are not as gifted at.
Oh, definitely. If you're not the one making others laugh, then yeah, you're definitely missing out. When you start thinking of a new story, so take the Floating Feldmans for instance, how does a new book start to form for you? A lot of people will think of a character or maybe a setting, or maybe there's a news headline or something, and then the
Right.
what if games start playing in your mind. When a new story starts to form for you, how does it begin?
So this one actually came from knowing, the first thing I knew was that I wanted a big cast and I wanted it to be family. So then it was really just about picking the right setting, and a cruise ship is just so funny. Like, even if you don't write anything interesting in the family dynamic, but you just described the cruise alone, there's so many opportunities for humor on these mass market boats. So that was just a natural setting. But yeah, I mean, like, family is really important to me. I married into a lovely family. I have a lovely family, but there's always going to be little, conflicts and things where we all have to make compromises. And I just feel like it's something everybody can relate to. And the Intermission, I think that there are single people who would enjoy the book, but I think it really resonated with married people as opposed to the Floating Feldmans. I think it doesn't matter who you are, married, single, 22, 82, male, female, gay, straight. You could be many different things, a professional, a non-professional, and you will find somebody in the book that you will relate to. So having the bigger cast was really important to me, and writing something that didn't only speak to, like, a certain segment of the population. So yeah, I just decided I'm going with family, and then the rest followed.
Well, there is a big cast in this book, and it's so much fun to kind of head hop, and look at these different perspectives and viewpoints. But tell me about Annette Feldman, because everything sort of revolves around Annette.
Mm-hmm. So she's complicated, and she's the one with the milestone birthday. And I feel like, without giving too much away, she's starting to see, the end in sight, and looking back on her life, as older people are prone to do, and saying, like, what did I've reaped, what have I sown? My children live nowhere near me. I don't know why. I was a devoted mother, I think, and yet, do I really have a closeness with these children? I barely talk to my son. I do talk to my daughter often, but is it substantive? And she's looking back and saying, why did this happen? And she doesn't really want to accept any responsibility for it, and whether the lack of closeness is her fault would be something that would be interesting to talk about in, book club or with a friend who reads the book. But she's not a perfect person by any means, but I think she wants to make everything right in her family at this point. And her children, I think, who kind of have resented her for a long time, as they get older and they are having families of their own and they mature, they're seeing her differently. And I feel like, especially with Elyssa, her daughter, who's now a mother, and a mother of children who ignore her and don't always respect her in the way they should, and don't include her in things in their life, she has more sympathy for her mother than she had before.
What a truism that is, that the things that I shook my head about at my parents, as you become a parent, there's a certain grace and understanding that comes with age and with going through those same experiences your parents did.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. When you started picking this cast of characters, were there certain attributes or maybe relational attributes that you really wanted to highlight, and did characters come out of that? For instance, was there a mother-son dynamic that you wanted to explore, and then therefore character X comes out of that? Or, how did you start to build the cast of characters?
So I definitely knew I wanted it to revolve around the grandma and her birthday. And I wanted she has a very good relationship with her husband. And I have a number of friends who have parents who friends who are around my age who have parents that are really close to each other. And they felt a little bit like it was the parents' relationship before their relationship with the parent, which I thought was really interesting to explore. And Annette and David really are so close and are such a team. And I don't know, I find that I don't think it's every couple that's like that, but I thought that was a very unique thing where they really have this very special bond. And the children almost feel a little sidelined by it. So I wanted to have that, where the parents, of course, Annette and David love their children, but they in some ways prioritize their own relationship. And I that's not the dynamic in my own family. I feel like my parents are very like the children first and then each other. But I don't just want to write about my own family. I want to explore things that are outside. And again, as part of like flexing my writing muscle, to write about families that aren't just mirror images of my own. So I started with that premise. And then I wanted, a kind of more with comparing the children, Freddie and Elise, like it was very important to me that it wasn't this very obvious, like one's perfect and one's a mess up, like they had to be more nuanced than that. And I think, well, since you've read the book and I don't want to give away spoilers, not all, it's really a case of like, it's not as it appears to be, and that was important to me as well. Cause I didn't want to just have like these very typical, like, characters where, so-and-so's perfect and went to Harvard and has an amazing job and has 2.5 children. And the other one is like, a total mess up and, constantly asking his parents for money. Like I needed I wanted more nuanced characters because that's real life.
Well, it is real life and it's real family that, and like we were talking about with your relationship with your parents, as you move into those stages of life, empathy comes with that. And I think with our siblings that happens, it's so easy to, I guess it happens with every relationship in life, the surface judgments, very rarely, pan out to be what we think they are. And as you put yourself in someone else's shoes, it becomes more and more evident. One thing I love about this and the family structure dynamic is that we see so many layers of relationships. We see, Annette as a spouse, and we see her as a mother, and we see her as a grandmother, and then we see the siblings, and then, their dynamic with their parents and with their children below them. And then as the siblings, there's so many layers that you get to explore. Was there one particular layer of relationship that was more fun to write?
I think it's like the petty things are fun to write, that like there's the little things that the people in our family do that annoy us. Like they take up the whole closet, they don't wait for us by the elevator, like the little tiny habits over time that grate on us, because I think those are the moments for like where our own worst attributes come out, that like our frustrations show, so I had fun writing, especially with like the teenagers, the siblings, Rachel and Darius, like the little ways they annoy each other. I loved to write about that.
Well, and it's usually the things that we would completely forgive a stranger for, but when they're done by our family, yes, it's like a special insult.
My husband tells me that if I ever complain about my family, he's like, if like your friend did that, you wouldn't even notice. I was like,
exactly.
I know. I'm sure that's true. I don't deny it.
One of the motivations for this book, you said, was getting to write from different perspectives and to write viewpoints that you'd never gotten to before. Were there things that you did to help you prepare to write like from a male perspective and things like that?
I guess, I've been married for 13 years. That definitely helped. I'd already gone through the experience of writing the Intermission, which I had took a long time to write, and I got really deep into the male voice there. I'm close with my parents. I'm close with my in-laws. That was really helpful in terms of seeing life through the eyes of the 70 plus set. The teenagers were interesting. I have a lot of nieces and nephews who are that age, and that really helped. So it came from my own family, and I'm a very social person, so I just feel like I know a lot of people, and I think I'm a little bit of a sponge with human behavior. So, and if I'm working on a particular book and I know I'm looking for like the behaviors of a 17-year-old, like I have my antenna up when I'm around a 17-year-old in a way that I might not notice their habits and what they do and say if I wasn't writing a character that age at the moment. So even if I don't know the people, if I go out to dinner and I see that there's a 17-year-old or so at the table next to me, I've like kind of eavesdropping a little on that table and like watching how they interact with their parents or their friends. I also like to think that like I'm a kid at heart and I kind of remember what it, granted, like we didn't have Snapchat and Instagram and all that stuff when I was that age, but like I've been having my 14-year-old niece living with me for the summer and I'm like, you know what, even though her life's so different than mine with the phone, the way she feels and like the emotions being 14, it's like not even that different than when I was 14. You know, something's just history, like it just repeats itself.
Yeah, it's like a different mechanism of expression, but the underlying stuff is pretty much the same.
Totally.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. When you talked earlier about that you're not an outliner and that different things that you do to kind of mine the story. Is there do you know the ending from the beginning? Do you know where the story is ultimately going to end up in the end?
Not really. I certainly did not know with the intermission if they were going to get back together or if they were going to break up, and that I felt my way through. This was a very tight timeline because it was like the week on the cruise ship, so I definitely didn't want a depressing ending where they all leave like not speaking to each other and it makes everything worse, but I also didn't want everything tied up neatly with a bow, so I was going for something sort of in between. But how exactly that was going to take shape only like came to me as I was writing. So yes, with this one I knew it was going to come out not absolutely perfect and not in disaster, but you know which character was going to shine and which character was going to have their comeuppance and which character was going to have regret. Like I didn't know that until I started writing.
Do you share your writing with anyone in the midst of drafting a book?
My agent, my editor, and sometimes my husband. Those are my go-tos.
Gotcha. At what point do you share, or how long do you give yourself with the characters and the plot to kind of before you start looking for input? Do you like to get a firm foundation laid that you're comfortable with, and then, or do you kind of bounce ideas off of people early on to make sure that the premise that you're thinking about is something that works?
Well, I definitely check the premise with my agent and my editor first. So before I even write a single word, I'm like, this is the idea I have for a book. What do you think? And we hash it out on the phone. Then before I look for any sort of like actual feedback, I'll have at least written half the book, I would say. But I don't want to write the whole book because if they have a major direction change, I don't want to have wasted all that time. So I would say about halfway through, I will give a draft over.
Gotcha. When you finish the first draft, what are edits like for you? Do you immediately go into editor mode? Do you set it aside? Do you kind of what's your process for starting revisions?
I mean, I just hate revisions. Nobody likes revisions, but there's some kinds of revisions I shouldn't say I hate it because there's some kinds I like. Like, I love taking a sentence that's awkward and making it, more streamlined and more readable. Like, that's the kind of editing I love. Like the nitty gritty line editing, I absolutely love it. Like if I'm shaping up dialogue, if I'm trimming sentences, I'm cutting words so that it reads better and reading things out loud and hearing if it's mellifluous. Like, I love that. What I hate is like, cut the character Sarah. She's like, we don't need her. Because then I feel like I'm like pulling a wooden block out of a Jenga structure and everything falls apart. So that kind of thing, or a plot change. Like, I don't think you should have this couple break up. And I'm like, oh my God, like I start feeling like anxiety, like flood my body. So I think I'm a wordsmith. I just love words and sentences and syntax so much. So that kind of editing I just love. But like structural changes to the book give me like massive amounts of anxiety. There's just no way around it. I feel like it's what I'm the worst at. And it requires me to like print out the book on paper instead of just like doing it on the computer or like laying out the pages because I get so confused. And then I'll often do like little chapter maps at the point where I've already written the whole book. I know I have to make a major change, so I'll do little summaries, like 3 lines on what happens in each chapter, so I can like then go back and be like, oh, okay, I'm cutting Sarah. Sarah was in chapter 4. I got to go back to 4. Like it gives me, it's almost like I outlined after I wrote the book, so that I know where to find things.
Because you are such a wordsmith and you love a good turn of phrase and it shows in your prose, do you ever get caught up in self-editing while you're writing a page or a paragraph where you're just like, that doesn't sound quite right, let me try this again? Or are you a pretty distant first drafter?
I'm pretty good with the first draft because I just like to make a lot of progress. So I'll just keep going, even if I know that like the sentence sounds terrible and I'm just not pleased with the way it's written. I will then just keep going. And that's when I go back like the next day or a couple days later, and I go back and I reread and I'm like, oh, this is like barely in English. I like the ideas are there, but it's terribly written. Like this sounds very juvenile, but I'll do that on a second pass. Like I've never sat with like one sentence for longer than 5 minutes because I just want to go and make progress. So I'm lucky I don't get bogged down with particular sentences or paragraphs for like long stretches of time. I just I'll come back to it.
Well, the new book is The Floating Feldmans. When you're hearing this episode, it's out available everywhere in paperback and Kindle edition. I promise you will find yourself in this book somewhere. And it's so much fun, as is your signature style. Really great, deep relationship stuff, but so much fun at the same time. Elyssa, if people are just learning about you and want to dig into more about what you do, is there a place they can connect with you online?
Instagram is great. Just my name at Elyssa Friedland, or author Elyssa Friedland on Facebook, and then my website, which is also a good place where I have all my book tour schedule up. So people can come say hi to me when I'm on tour.
Excellent. We'll link to all of it in the show notes of this episode, and of course link to the book, The Floating Feldmans. Elyssa, thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Thanks for tuning in to the Author Stories podcast. Be sure to subscribe at hankgarner.com or on your favorite podcasting app. Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On Walpurgis night, when the moon is high, hell's bells ring and witches must answer. They dapple their breasts with rendered fat of murdered babes, straddle their brooms and take to the sky, as the devil wills, to speed through dreamy midnight air to the summit of the Brockenberg, that haunted peak shrouded in swirling mists, where a glen of gnarled limbs and wan moonlight awaits to host their debauches and blasphemies. Now to the Brocken the witches ride. The stubble is gold and the corn is green. There shall the carnival sabbat be seen, and the devil shall come to preside. The accuser elopes from the bowels of hell, a sure-footed, goat-headed, many-horned beast with cloven hooves and a staff of bone. He perches upon the witch altar to brood in cerulean half-light, a winged silhouette with watchful red eyes. The witches gather and bow to their master, upon his charred rump give the shameful kiss, then imps beat the drum and a round dance begins. Lash yourselves into frenzy, hags! Pass the chalice of pure marrow broth. Whip the ground with your hair, tread the sky with your feet, dance with joined hands around Satan's cold fire. Then find out a nook of nettles and moss, and lay with the rough-skinned beast of your choosing, suckling some rancid teat of desire. But hist! The cock crows. Away, away! Gather your tatters and broomsticks and wits, back to your huts, to your thresholds and hearths, and become once more, at the red break of day, the furtive adder in your neighbor's garden. The ghost host of the Salem Sorcery Tour, dazzling in his steampunk Victorian morning crepe, let the spell he'd woven trail through the twilight air like a hag across the moon, then chirped, "Isn't that silly?" and bowed, sweeping the wet grass with his satin-ribboned top hat. The tour group gave a polite round of applause. Nobody believes that stuff today, but the Puritans sure did. They took witches very seriously. If they went down in the morning and bought eggs, and one was rotten, surely the devil had come in the night, gone boop, tee-hee-hee, then scampered off on his little hooves. And who's in league with the devil? Witches. We're taught that the Puritans were super nice and cute with little buckles on their hats, but it's not the case, folks. They were fanatics. Witch hunts don't happen in a healthy society. They hated kids. They hated women. They were crazy. And that craziness. He turned on the spot, casting a protective circle around the stone garden of the witch memorial. Got these people killed